I could just do some story sharing about the history and context of the multilingual access model and how it grows, sustains, and evolves, because now, close to 30 years later, it's still evolving, learning, and growing. I want to ground ourselves in multilingual, multicultural ideas and practical tips to you all to assess, support, and assist programs to meet their cultural and language needs for survivors, their children, and your communities. And then weave this multilingual, multicultural approach to end domestic violence and sexual assault to the diversity of all our people, right? So I know we are all dedicated and have worked to end domestic violence, and we know that domestic violence crosses all lines, and so we, as those advocates and champions for that change, need to cross all lines as well. And we want to create action steps to increase cultural and linguistic access to prevention and services in your programs, your communities, and in your state coalition. So I want to start in kind of two frames. So first, let's think about how are we reaching underserved survivors, advocates, and communities. So really focusing in and identifying and building the capacity of people and programs in underserved communities. So for you, thinking about who are those folks, who are those communities, and how you're building relationships, how you're strengthening programs and organizations in those communities, how you increase access and readiness, and what I call building the power of the margins and intersections. So I know that you as your state coalition and also as your on-the-ground front lines workers, all of who you are, you're doing this work, and I'm just thinking, let's make sure to make that pivot in our work to really think about what are those margins and how to build the power of that and the intersections of that in the work that we do overall. Okay, and we could have more discussion or questions, or actually you can throw those on the chat line, which Cannon, thank you so much, is helping me track as I'm talking, so that if you flag some questions about that or want to open up we are going to plan in this agenda to open up your mute lines or welcome you to and really have some conversation or dialogue. So I want to do that through chat lines while I'm making this presentation, and then certainly opening it up towards the end of this presentation for our conversations together. Okay, so what I just, in the previous slide, what I just tried to overview is first how we make that pivot, how each one of you that are on this call and others really think about how we're building the power of the margins, right? And then now the second piece of this is how we, as perhaps more mainstream domestic violence programs that serve everybody, like you might be a DV shelter program that serves everyone in your area, you might be legal services, you might be your state coalition that are serving abroad, casting a broad net. And so from that aspect, how do you build cultural and linguistic capacity of DV advocates, programs, and coalitions? So in that, it is kind of taking that role and setting those expectations and support to meet cultural and linguistic needs for survivors and their children in their communities. And that takes communicating commitment and expectation in multiple ways. Through the way that you do your policy directives, your trainings, You highlight innovative programs and people and community profiles, your RFP questions, your program requirements. So all of the way that you're structuring your organizational culture and people are those ways that really are setting that tone that you value and commit and centering cultural and linguistic needs and inclusivity. The other aspect of that is really strengthening people, programs, and coalitions to address the needs of those underserved communities through training, TA, requirements, expectations. As Canon had mentioned in the intro, I know that you folks have been doing that, and I look forward to the continued and evolving and growing continuum of doing our own kind of learning and growing on this issue and strengthening that cultural and linguistic access. So also, I think it's nice for us to really think about collaborations. You hear that all the time, and now we're even hearing that, in funders or at high levels. Yes, we should collaborate, or here's a collaborative grant or a collaborative project, right? And so it's for us to take that pause and really think, what are meaningful collaborations? And I think it's especially important to do that when we're thinking about cultural and linguistic access. So it's really promoting authentic collaborations that are based on respect for people and their organizations, their unique contributions, and really being equitable about shared power and shared resources. So I know that all of us in doing this domestic violence work, we know about power and control, right? And we know about the abuse of dominant practices, and even in a well-intended way, that kind of pattern of power control over people gets in the way. So I feel like doing access to cultural and linguistic inclusivity really gives us this opportunity and also a challenge to really do what we mean by meaningful collaboration. What's a way that we do that it really is authentic and shares and builds on equitable shared power and shared resources? And I feel like doing that really deepens collaborations through ongoing relationship building, support, participation in community events and programs, regular meetings and communication, and essential conversations. This is also something that, sure, it's easy to say, but often for us as DV movement, I think it's hard to do because we keep ourselves so busy. We're already overloaded, overworked, overextended, and I really want to honor that and also find ways that we are creating for ourselves some spaciousness, some breathing room, because without that, a lot of times, unfortunately, say something like cultural or linguistic or things that are maybe outliers in our work are the first to be cut during hard times or ignored or invisible or, oh, yeah, we appreciate that, but we don't have time, or maybe a harder to reach group or harder to bridge, those language advocate or cultural bridges. Even though we're well-intended, sometimes they drop, right, or fall through the cracks. So I think this is a time for us to really have some meaningful collaboration and some space to think about that for ourselves, right? And building the power of collaboration by focusing on our shared vision, goals to address cultural and language access, and not limited to just, okay, we'll do this because we have the funding or the project, how do we meet our project deliverables? I know just the fact that you're taking the time to be on this webinar means that you are prioritizing and lifting this up and opening yourselves up, suspending certainty, right, to kind of be open to what are the new or continued ways that I can strengthen this aspect of my work. So now I want to just practically give the example of the multilingual access model. So this is like one practical example of that I'd love to share the context and the history about, and that, you know, I am also of that peer learning approach, is that this is for me to share, to do locally and share globally. So really want to share that for you to adapt and to take that on, aspects of that make most sense, because you are the experts and really the folks most grounded in your own communities and populations there in New Jersey and beyond. All right, so what is the multilingual access model? And basically it helps survivors, so it really is directed specifically to non-English speaking survivors who often are blocked from programs because of their language and cultural needs. And so it really, this multilingual access model helps survivors because we are able to be whole person throughout the case and to get language support and interpretation from trained anti-violence advocates. It also helps communities because communities get training and skills, they get jobs, they strengthen their anti-violence work in organizations or just in their own roles in their communities and families, and strengthens anti-violence cultures in our communities. The history is that, you know, I started Emblem in the late 1980s when, well, okay, even in the mid-1980s. I was in my 20s then. Now I'm in my late 50s. In those days, my first job was that I wanted to work at a domestic violence shelter. And I was the first and only Asian person that was hired at a shelter, I guess what I would call mainstream domestic violence shelter in San Francisco, which was one of the first domestic violence shelters to start up in the mid-1970s. This was in the early 80s, and I was the first and only one. And in San Francisco, 30% of our population was Asian, and from all different, you know, over 40 plus different Asian Pacific Islander groups. And yet I was the first one in domestic violence to do this. And, you know, being a Japanese American born and raised here in California as a third generation Japanese American, I had like about a 4-year-old level of Japanese that I was, you know, fluent in or not fluent in. And you can imagine for that domestic violence shelter, very few Asians, specifically those who, with language and culture as a barrier, came to that shelter. They did not feel like they belonged. And that was part of my motivation, that we needed an Asian women's shelter. And that was why I got together with other Asian women in our community and started Asian Women's Shelter. In that time, I knew that, okay, this shelter cannot rely on my, you know, 4-year-old degree of Japanese, and that's it. And how are we going to meet our language needs? So we created, and I've just made up the name, MultiLingual Access Model. And that is where I recruited and trained bilingual women in our community to be on-call language advocates. And I also wanted to value that, not as an extra thing, but really as central. And so paid them by the hour as on-call language advocates. They went through a training, and in that way, we were able to create a project that we launched first starting in 1990 with 3 languages, and then people really loved that idea and that design. So other domestic violence shelters, legal services, the DA's office, they all wanted to share our multilingual access model. And so we launched a citywide project, which we called Citywide Emblem, in about 3 years, so mid-1995, into a 2-year pilot. And now let's just fast forward. I could tell you a lot about that, but just fast forward. Now today, almost 30 years later, we have our continued Asian Women's Shelter multilingual access model. We have the citywide multilingual access model. We created an anti-trafficking collaborative in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we continue to adapt this multilingual access model in other organizations and states throughout the U.S., which now you are part of as well. And I welcome that, and we will continue to do peer learning and building together. So why language access? Language is a fundamental tool for human connection, understanding, and interdependence. Everyone deserves safety. All survivors deserve the right to tell their story, be understood, rebuild their lives with support, and safety requires language access. Basic needs are not special needs. And I feel like that had been a common flaw, even from a lot that are very well intended, treating language and cultural access as a special need, when really for those that get to domestic violence because of language and culture, it's a basic need. And also domestic violence, abusers have used isolation and lack of language or culture as a tool to perpetuate domestic violence and that abuse of power. So to get at this is not a special need, but really a basic need and a foundation to getting at domestic violence. And the other thing that I've discovered is really by committing to it in that way as not a special need but a basic need, that we've kind of lifted all boats. That there are actually things that we have learned through reaching the needs of those most hard to reach that have lifted all boats, that have really built the quality and the design and the work of our domestic violence programs that meet and help the needs and designs of all domestic violence survivors. And so that is kind of what I meant by saying Emblem helps us build safety for survivors accessing services and survivors who never do so. That also is not just from our existing programs, but has helped us learn and grow how we're meeting these places where people are falling through the cracks, right? So really this is, again, to underscore what I just said about basic needs are not special needs. Really just lying with that philosophy and keeping it core, that all survivors of domestic violence or sexual violence deserve language and cultural access through advocates and interpreters who are trained anti-violence counselors. And how does this work? So that at Asian Women's Shelter, we recruited, interviewed, trained, and hired bilingual community members with interests, concerns, expertise to work as paid on-call language advocates. So a little story about that is, like, for example, for myself, maybe I was thinking, oh yeah, like if we could get interpreters or, people who had that training. Well, sure, that's good, but what I discovered that wasn't the key, most important qualification I was looking for in those interviews. the most important thing I was looking for is that core value and strength to be an advocate. It's the same way that we interview any advocates or any volunteers in our programs, right? We just, because somebody has a bilingual skill or a different culture, we want to also hold them to that same kind of deep commitment. The difference is being able to translate that, even in English, to say it in a way that people can understand and can access. So, for example, if I said in an interview, what is your commitment or experience with domestic violence? Well, they might not even use that term, domestic violence, in their communities or cultures, or what they might know about it is, say, something they heard or read a story about in the U.S., and maybe they think, oh, that doesn't pertain in our community or our extended families, when it does, but they just have had no words for it or no access to ways that it really is relevant and resonates with their own language, culture, and sensibilities. So that is part about that. And in doing that was a journey that we provided folks. We took them through that interview, and we invited them to be at a training, which was, I think this is very familiar to you. You probably have 40-plus hour trainings for volunteers or advocates. And for us here in California, it met our California Evidence Code, and I'm sure all around the U.S., each state has their evidence code or works with the national, standards on that kind of certification or that, that goal of what it means to have domestic violence counselors or advocates. That's what that is. We had these language advocates self-identify their language capabilities. And, in this role of bilingual advocates, that was also the beauty of that too, is that it really has room for a continuum of language skill. So we had people that maybe they grew up here, so they were bilingual, but they didn't have the formal language training or skills, interpretation skills, but they would be lovely, right, to talk and be in a group with non-English speakers around a support group around domestic violence issues, or go grocery shopping or have a chat around the meals at the domestic violence shelter. That kind of interpretation or language access is good, and that level is fine, and we could use that. And then also we could also use that level of people whose language skills were good, that they could actually go to court, and maybe they're not the certified court interpreter, but certainly they are a bilingual advocate, just like any advocates who go to a court and accompany together with a survivor for that support, or just for not court interpretation, but for be able to express their questions and also their thinking and their way to demystify and navigate through the court experience. So it's that spectrum that there's room for in creating those language advocates, and that we actually started this little detail below, and I'm happy to talk in more detail as you all adapt this and do this in your own programs or your own coalition. Is like, that was a learning moment. I think I started with the language advocates as consultants, and then it kind of got flagged, by the IRS or something. It's like, how come you have 40 consultants? Like, what are they really doing? And all of that. And then I realized, it was better for their on-call consultant work, for them as on-call language advocates, and also for us as an organization, to following the rules as an employer, that we really put them on our payroll as on-call workers and pay them by the hour. So in general, at Asian Women's Shelter, our staff is more not on-call hourly paid, but more exempt, staff employment. And we also have, this pool of hourly paid on-call workers, and that's the language advocate folks. So that was how we designed it internally. And community change grows from the inside out. So, this was like a hidden gem that I found, was that recruiting and training these community members to do the interpretation and be the on-call, train them to be on-call language advocates. What I realized is they are whole people in their own communities. And so doing that really built the community strengths and infused the communities with anti-violence information, skills, and leadership. That was really a gem that now, let me back up and talk about this a little bit more, was a gem that has created our community building. So for example, let me give you one story. Anri Menzi, a Korean woman. At that time, she owned kind of like a soda fountain store, sandwich store. And she was also a religious person that was actually a reverend level in her Presbyterian faith. And then she volunteered to be a volunteer at Asian Women's Shelter, and we hired her also. She trained to be an on-call language advocate in Korean. And doing that, she grew in that. She was a gem. And what she said was, for Korean folks, that's good. Some of them are coming to your shelter, but a lot of them, they would really do well to have some influence from our Korean church, because they really go to the Korean church a lot and listen to that. And it would be also good at the Korean Community Center if we had like a support group or some way that Korean survivors of domestic violence and also advocates could cluster. So that's where Asian Women's Shelter, we listened to that and we said, fabulous. And I got a grant that I could share with the Korean Community Center. I gave that to, but joint cluster with them to start. We were able to start a community-centered domestic violence program called Shimta, and Reverend Anri Menzi was able to start a Korean faith-based organizing, which she still does today and is really recognized as a national leader in Korean faith-based organizing. That is something that was beyond what we could do at Asian Women's Shelter without somebody like that, right? So and I have many, many stories like that. So that's just one example of how engaging and co-creating with on-call language advocates can really grow our organizations and grow our communities and movement. So what's citywide Emblem? That's another aspect of it, is when we started doing this, then all the other programs like other domestic violence shelters, etc., would always refer their people that they got on the hotline, our citywide hotline, etc., for language and culture that they could not meet. And that is certainly great, and it's both and. That then they also would be wonderful if they, in their programs, could adapt language access. So we created this Asian citywide multilingual access model, and we were able to get, at that time, like 4 different organizations in San Francisco, Asian Pacific Islander Legal Outreach, which did legal services for survivors and others in domestic violence and sexual assault and human trafficking. Rosalie House, which was another more mainstream domestic violence shelter. Brennan House, which was a transitional domestic violence housing. And Woman Inc., which was a citywide domestic violence hotline in San Francisco. All of those became our citywide partners, and we were able to share this pool of language access folks, the Emblem folks. In doing that, we really also held them to, okay, if you're going to do that, the inside of your program really needs to be committed to language and culture, not just a token add-on, but really infused in your programs. And so that has really built the depth of those programs, as well as, so not just an add-on extra thing, but really in the way that has improved their ability to be language and culturally accessible services and programs, and our collaboration partners. So now just who are these people? You know, I shared the story of Anne Menzie, and, you know, here's just one capsule of these multilingual, bi-multilingual, and bi-multicultural community members, graduates from Asian Women's Shelters training, covered by the Domestic Violence Counselor privilege. They're on-call paid anti-violence advocates, agents of change, and really a critical part of our teams. This is just one example, and years that you create on your own are going to grow in this way as well, depending on your geographic region and what languages are spoken in your areas. Here in the San Francisco Bay Area, in East Asian, we have Korean, Cantonese, Mandarin, Chao, Zhao. So this is like one example of not just Chinese, but these are all maybe what would be considered Chinese languages. Some of them, like Cantonese, Mandarin, Chao Zhao, Shanghainese, Toisanese, these are all based on time and areas. Maybe sometimes we would call them dialects, but just like in Europe, it would be as if we're saying, oh, French is a dialect of European language. You know, that's kind of what we're saying when we say in Chinese language. These are dialects. They're really the languages in that whole, you know, huge area of what we kind of call China, or maybe what is better said as Asia, parts of Asia. And like what we call Southeast Asia, you know, is Vietnamese, Lao, Thai, Mien, Hmong, Burmese, Malay, Khmer, Indonesian. Again, same kind of thing, not lumping them in, but these are all the kinds of languages that are spoken in what I guess we would call Southeast Asia. And then South Asian Asia, you know, Nepalese, Hindu, Urdu, Punjabi, Bengali, Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, those are all areas. Again, like if you say India, in India, like, you know, there's what, 30 plus or 100 different, I guess what we would call dialects, us Western folks, when really they're all of these different areas and regional languages. And then, of course, the West, what we like to say, West Asia, you know, the Middle East and Arabic, Farsi, those languages as well. And then I guess what we would call non-Asian, but all of the other things like in the Americas and in Europe and Africa. So we have Spanish, Russian, French, Hebrew, Portuguese, Dutch. So that's where we're at now with this language access. And here's some of what the language advocates do. I'm not going to read all of those, that's why I did the slide, but you know, crisis calls, intakes, written translation, support groups, cultural liaison work, in-person language mediary work, like taking a bus, going to the bank, court accompaniment. I gave some of those examples. Accompaniment to public benefits, like going to the welfare office or medical or health appointments. All of those places being accompanied and doing that together with language advocates. That, okay, side story I'll just tell you is, that is an example of this margin to center. So, for example, we would go everywhere together with folks, like, go to the laundromat or go to the welfare office with the bilingual advocates, mainly motivated by, or taking the bus together, mainly motivated by these immigrant language and cultural needs. And what we realized is even for folks like that we kind of assume like American born or, that were born and raised here, certainly when you're surviving domestic violence, that could really be a beautiful part of the safety net that makes you feel like you belong, that you're valued, that you deserve, and that you're safe by getting these accompaniments, and not in a patronizing way, but like someone going together with you on all of this stuff. So that helped us really build that into our jobs and our time, and not seeing as like extra work, but something that really is valued and certainly has paid off in allowing, I guess, what we call empowerment or independence that we are helping create in domestic violence survivors. That side-by-side advocacy work has paid off on all, no matter their language and cultural needs. And so things that we've done are, creating language and culturally specific educational materials, mobilized to change local policy. So actually, when we had a language access ordinance in San Francisco, those that were trying to advocate for language access ordinance, they said us at that intersection of domestic violence advocacy were some of the best stories and the most compelling reasons that convinced San Francisco to pass a language access ordinance for the whole city, not just on domestic violence, but for any, language access for workers' rights, other kinds of things that were police response, etc., that were needed. And we were at not the margins, but the center of being part of a compelling team. So just wanted to give some of these resources, certainly getting to the source. So now I'm outside of Asian Women's Shelter, and I did that by intention because I didn't want to be one of those old founder syndrome kind of people, and I really wanted to walk the talk of sharing leadership. And so that is why they are, again, continue to grow, and I really highly recommend them as a source to connect directly with. Also, we wrote this multilingual access model that back in 1999, so it's old, but it's still kind of a good little manual or tool that you could get through VawaNet. And also, of course, like Cannon talked about before, and we will at the end of this, you can always reach us, and I really want to shout out and lift up to Cannon and Wendy, part of the Interpretation Resource Center here, housed at AP Institute, which is really a part of our national resource, national cultural resource. So they are a great resource for this as well. So now I want to end this meeting with you all by just having you join the conversation. We want to open up, so unmute and open up your voices. Encourage more for you to talk about and to ask questions, as well as have your own reflections and your peer learning experiences. And I feel like, okay, let's just really put this into action so it's not just a philosophical or virtual webinar, but really like, okay, I hope that I've given you some ideas or some thinking that you can put into an action plan. You know, have you had any aha moments or curiosity or inspirations from me blabbing on to you right now? And can you think of at least 2 things that your organization or your state action plan for cultural and linguistic capacity building? And maybe getting at that right now at this moment, you know, for those of you on the call, what are some of the most doable action steps that you could take on when you return home or you get back into your busy days today, or, you know, hopefully do your radical self-care and have a nice weekend? And what are some action steps that you could take this year that will leverage the most impact and increase to cultural and linguistic gaps for survivors and their children? Yeah, so unmute your phone by pressing that *6. Like, it says Polly Miller, but it's really actually Cannon Hahn who's using Polly Miller's computer. Unfortunately, our Polly is sick today, so she's out, but Cannon is a champion in this, and so he's doing that chat facilitation and some of our facilitation on this webinar.
Hi, this is Catherine with the Coalition. First, Becky, I wanted to thank you and also to thank Cannon for presenting us with this information. I love the information. I don't really have an aha moment, but I have a question. When working with volunteers from within specific communities, and I love that idea, but I also wonder, I know that in some communities it can be difficult to deal with the issue of domestic violence. There are some preconceived notions that are not good for victims, and how do you guys work against that or weed that out in your screening process?
That's a great question. I feel like that is why, and I think if it might be in that manual, and if not, we could be sure to send you some sample questions we did in the interview process, and or even the job announcement, inviting people to come and be volunteers, and doing that in a way that brought in people who the core thing we were looking for are people who they didn't have to know about domestic violence, but they had to be open to the value, right? That is not blaming victims and is open to the value of believing in and supporting victims and survivors of domestic violence, and also being open to maybe own our own stereotypes or prejudices or gaps in knowledge and understanding about domestic violence and their survivors. So, for example, I don't know if what you already have. Like, what I would suggest is start with what you already have. So do you, and I think you do in New Jersey. In fact, I think you know, there are some champions around domestic violence, anti-domestic violence work in your state, and so maybe even in your community. So I would say, like, starting with them, and they could help identify folks and also do part of the interviews. So how that turned out is, let me give you an example. Myself, as a Japanese American born and raised here, but when I'm doing my interviews, say somebody says, oh yeah, but you know, in our Asian community, we we value male dominance, or we wouldn't accept that. I mean, it's okay to use physical discipline in for our partners and our kids, you know. So we wouldn't have a domestic violence thing or something. And then what I would say is, well, actually, it's not okay. And there has been a legacy of time of people who have said, no, that's not our values of our community. And that is what this is all about. So something like that. And I would even tell stories. Like I would say, remember Kakakomedera, the refuge temple in Japan in the mid-century, in the mid 1800s, or you think it was even before that, where they basically had what we would call now a domestic violence shelter, because it was like people could escape there and be safe, and we have that Buddhist value of nonviolence. And a lot of women would go there. So I would say, you know, if I'm retelling this or telling my version of the Buddhist, I'm born and raised Buddhist also. My Buddhist values is like, no, that has always been something that, has been there. And that's what we're lifting up and, want to strengthen. That thread, that's always been part of our values. So stuff like that, it's helpful. And what I learned in response is some of the volunteers or people, they were like, oh my gosh, what a relief. This is the first time I've been seeking that kind of validation, or I always kind of felt funny about that, but I'm so excited to be part of your training or whatever, right? I got a lot of those kind of answers. And I also got these answers where people were a little bit stuck in, continuing or just maybe even having that kind of abusive feelings. And so they maybe weren't ready to be the volunteers, but that is also another opportunity for some support group or some awareness or education, right?
Yeah. Great, thank you. And I think it would be really helpful. You'll send out to everyone those questions, that book.
Yeah. I'll
Great.
get Cannon. You could maybe talk to. I'll get your help and others, also Asian Women's Shelters as a direct source help to make sure to get you some good sample documents. And certainly there's that link to this under VawaNet, but we could also revisit that and update it.
Great, thank you.
So this is Cannon. If you're listening to the webinar via your computer, unfortunately we don't have it set up for you to dial in. So if you've got a question or comment for Becky, if you can type that in the chat section, or you can try dialing in to ask your question. Thank you. So Becky, we have a question about the use of language line, particularly in other than Spanish languages with clients. Do you have any experience with language line or telephonic interpretation?
Yes. Well, certainly language line is good and something that you could use, but I always think of it as kind of a backup resort. And really, I would love to lovingly challenge you to think about how could you maybe take a deeper dive in providing cultural and linguistic access. And again, like I was saying in my presentation, thinking of it as a basic need, not an extra need or a special need. Because think about it, if put yourself in the shoes of someone, if you were non-English speaking, maybe immigrant, unfamiliar with mainstream services or the way that we're addressing domestic violence here in the U.S. So like, just imagine it. Maybe that would be kind of a good thing for yourself. Like, imagine, you, and maybe you even had this experience, like you moved to Brazil, or you moved to Japan, or you moved to the island of Chuuk. It's coming to mind because Ken and I were just talking about some of the work we're doing with the Pacific territories. So, just imagine you were from there. You did not speak English, and you don't know what's the cultural way that they're going to address this situation that I'm in, and I'm also panicked, right? I'm fearing for my life and not just myself, well, certainly myself, but my partner or my children or my extended family. What do I do? And I feel like, to really get at that, wouldn't it be nice to have a cultural and linguistic advocate who could think together with you like we do as DV advocates, and work on that journey with you and the unique yet not but common ways that we're being isolated and fearing our experience of domestic violence, right? So I feel like, yes, Language Line is good, and at the same time, what more can we do to really do our domestic violence advocacy work?
Hi, and this is Cannon. And so in terms of interpretation and Language Line, one of the things that has come up pretty frequently in our trainings is the quality of interpretation through Language Line. And so Language Line is the actual company that provides the service, and a lot of agencies work with Language Line, and what we've been hearing is some concerns about the quality of some of their telephonic interpreters. There have been reports that interpreters through Language Line have told clients not to leave their clients or ask for a restraining order because it would bring shame on the family or that they would get deported. So obviously there have been some concerns about the quality and the bias of some of the telephonic interpreters. And so some of these DV agencies have contracted with different telephonic interpretation companies. One that comes to mind that I've been seeing is Pacific Interpreters. So if you're interested in the different interpretation companies, just touch base with myself or Catherine, and we'll pass along a couple of the telephonic interpretation companies we've come across that are providing services. Generally, we encourage you, if you're using telephonic interpreters, both telephonic and in-person interpreters, is to try to implement some level of quality control. So if you're using a telephonic interpreter, usually what they'll do is they'll give you their interpreter identification number. And so what you can do is after the interview, and this doesn't have to be every time, but contact Language Line again and ask for a different interpreter, and then do a quick check with your client to say, hey, how did that go? Were you comfortable with the interpreter? Do you have any? And then also you can ask questions with the client and using another interpreter that are open-ended. So you can ask, well, can you talk about what we discussed during our meeting? And so in that way, then the client can provide information to you, and you can see if it's consistent with what your understanding was. So you can kind of do a spot check on the quality, but you can also make sure that the interpreter isn't saying anything or stepping out of role. What we encourage also programs to do, if you start identifying problem interpreters, create a blacklist and share that blacklist with your colleagues to say, hey, this is a bad interpreter, in addition to filing a complaint with Language Line or whatever company you're using. Also, if you've identified good interpreters, we encourage you to request those interpreters when you have the time to make those requests. So if you know a client's coming in next week, you can contact Language Line and say, hey, we need an interpreter on this day at this time, and we're requesting interpreter 5743. The other thing we encourage you to do is when you're negotiating your contracts to find out if the interpretation company has interpreters that have experience or training interpreting for victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. So if you ask that question, they'll say, yeah, we have interpreters that work with this coalition or with this shelter. So that way you have some information, and at least you know that you're getting some interpreters that have worked around domestic violence and sexual assault, and you're not getting somebody that could possibly be uncomfortable with it. Because we've done trainings with interpreters, and a lot of times what happens is they're placed, they're at the call center, and so they may not be aware that this is a domestic violence or sexual assault call. And so we know that around vicarious trauma, they could be former victims, they could be current victims. They could also be people that have biases against domestic violence or victims of domestic violence. So, there are some certain things that you can do ahead of time to try to minimize any potential issues that you could have when working with telephonic interpreters. And if you want more information about that, let Catherine and myself know, and we would be more than happy to follow up with you.
And thank you, Kenan. That's perfect. And this is a perfect example of both and. It's great if you have like a language line or a telephonic way, and just like any kind of profession or interface that you're doing, as you guys know, that some are better at understanding or knowing domestic violence, and some are not or have their own blocks. So that are some great ways, tips for navigating that and advocating that. And also, I want to emphasize the advocacy part, the cultural part. So what are we doing internally with our existing domestic violence programs and services? It's not just about, yes, it is the language access, and yes, it is the cultural access. And so how we could use this language and cultural advocacy opportunity, I feel like that was a bonus of what the Emblem model was an example of ways we were able to really infuse that and integrate that as an integral part of our domestic violence programs. I hope that explains it a little more than what I was trying to say. Are there any other questions or comments or things that you would want to share? And this is what I also love is like there's no judgment on our part. It's really just appreciating you for reaching out and being on this webinar. And so we as domestic violence programs, let's talk, brag to me or tell me about your proud moments about how you're doing this work, and share that, and also your fabulous flops. That things that I shared with you were things like when I was sharing about my limited bilingual capacity myself. But then that actually helped me create this gem that is so much bigger than myself or my program could have been when I created the multilingual access model. So, just examples of please share.
Well, so this is Cannon, and so if there wasn't anything that anybody wanted to add, or in terms of questions or comments or anything that you wanted to share, I just wanted to talk about some next steps for us. Catherine and I will be talking, and then you'll be receiving an email from Catherine with the PowerPoint. And what we'd really like to hear back from all of you on is what resources, what training, what kind of technical assistance would you like around language access? Because once again, we are here to support you, and you don't have to recreate the wheel. A lot of programs are doing great work around this, and so it's our job to connect you to the different kinds of promising practices that are out there. And so, going from the very basic, we need to develop a language access plan. Can you help us with that? To, hey, we've got a client who came from Guam and speaks Chuk, and we don't know how to find an interpreter. Can you help us find an interpreter? To, we've got some people that are interested in volunteering as interpreters. Can you help us do a training for them on how they can improve their interpretation skills? So it covers a wide range. So once you get the email from Catherine with the PowerPoint slides, we'd really appreciate it if you had some ideas about how we can better support you.
Oh, okay. So as I close, I wanted to share with you about Grace Lee Boggs. But first, I also see in the chat box from Cheryl saying, like, how would you know if an interpreter wasn't saying something in the right way because of if you don't speak that language? I mean, that's really a good question. And again, that is why I've really been a proponent of Emblem and just other ways that you are gathering and connecting and collaborating with those bilingual folks in your communities or in your state, and working together with them, because that's also how I found out things too. Like, I would go with one of the language advocates and they'd say, oh, that court interpreter, they didn't really translate what our survivor was trying to say. They used the wrong words, or they minimized it. Those kinds of subtle aspects or ways that we wouldn't have known because we didn't speak that language. So another plug for the both and approach of interpreters and advocates, bilingual advocates. And then closing, I just wanted to hark back and remember Grace Lee Boggs, who probably many of you know of. She's really well known. Unfortunately, she passed away a few months ago towards the end of 2015. That 100 years, close to it. I think she was 99. So a good long time and she kept going, even, in her later 90s, a long-time Detroit political labor and social activist, author, and philosopher. And what she said is, this is the way we evolve to a higher stage of humanity. And unless we want to live in terror, which is what we know so well around domestic violence and other ways that violence impacts us, if we want to do that, unless we want to do that the rest of our lives, what we need to do is change our view. We have the opportunity to take this great leap forward in these very challenging times. And we can change our institutions and ourselves, seize the opportunities, launch our imaginations beyond the thinking of the past, and we can discern who we are and expand on our humanness and our sacredness. And that's how we change the world. What happens because we will be the change. So thank you all for being part of this webinar, conversation, and presentation here's just a quick appreciation from myself, Becky, and also Cannon, who's been on this call, and Wendy. We're all part of the staff here at Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, and appreciate our being together today.